So welcome everybody. My name is Aisling Clardy. I work at the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Sport, Physical Education, Recreation and Fitness. And this is the final webinar in the webinar series on inclusive martial arts that is being run by UNESCO ICM, so the International Centre for Martial Arts, Youth Development and Engagement. We've had a fantastic series so far all throughout the summer, and this is the final session, as I said, and this is a Q&A session. So we have some of our panelists that have sat on some of the various webinars throughout the series, and they have offered their time to be with you here today to answer your questions and dive a little bit deeper into the content that we've covered so far. So going on order of my screen. So first, what I will do, I'll take a few moments. I'll give each of our panelists a couple of minutes to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into the questions. So going on order of how you're showing up on my screen. So first of all, we have Colm Hooley. So Colm is from Ireland, and Colm sat on webinar 5 on coach's perspective. So Colm is the CEO of Spinal Injuries Ireland and a Defence Lab instructor, and also has a spinal injury himself. So Colm, would you like to share a little bit more about yourself, your martial arts background, and even your professional expertise on the topic?
Gosh, I suppose in some ways I come to it from two different perspectives. One before my accident and then again after my accident. I mean, so I can see the value of martial arts as somebody who acquires a disability. So my passion is just introducing the benefits of it to people. Through my work with spinal injuries, you actually have given me the credit of being the CEO. I've actually stepped down after 21 years. But so my main focus now is with Defence Lab at getting the message out, the value of learning self-defense, and not just the physical aspect, but the being part of a community and helping people's confidence. I mean, that's my real passion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Colm. And we're thrilled to have you with you. I'm very, very grateful. So next here, showing up on my screen, we have Nick Hoekstra. Welcome, Nick. So Nick has sat on many of the webinars. On the first webinar on adapted physical activity and universal design for learning. He also sat on the webinar 2, the athlete's perspectives, also webinar 3, tradition and inclusion, and also one of the former Q&A sessions. So Nick is an avid martial artist, and he's been blind since he was 7. And he's also very active, very busy with all of his work and research, promoting inclusive education. And he's currently doing a PhD in special education at the University of Kansas. So Nick, would you like to share a little bit more about yourself?
Oh, thank you. No, you did a great job. I think most I can do is echo kind of Colin's words. And yeah, for me, I approach this from 2 directions. One is as a martial artist with a disability. This martial arts for me were key in developing self-esteem, developing more confidence, and also developing a community of friends over the years. And on the other hand, my work is in promoting inclusion, promoting inclusive education, and it's been such an interesting privilege to be able to link my work more in the academic sphere to also my passion of the martial arts. This has been just a wonderful opportunity, and I really hope to be able to continue this forward into the future.
Thank you so much, Nick. I'm pretty sure you will. Absolutely. And so we also have Dr. George Jennings. So Dr. Jennings was on webinar 3, inclusion and tradition, and also Q&A 1. So Dr. Jennings is a senior lecturer in sports sociology and physical culture at Cardiff Metropolitan University in Wales. And also, as all of our panelists, has a strong background in martial arts. So Dr. Jennings, will you share a little bit more about yourself, please?
Thanks, Aisling. Yeah, and I like the way that the other 2 have introduced themselves so far in like 2 paths or 2 aspects or major aspects of their professional identities. And I'd say the same. I began as a practitioner of martial arts, beginning with Taekwondo, later Wing Chun, which is more of my long-standing practice, some Kendo and also Tai Chi. And basically I became a researcher of martial arts, interested in how they're taught, their pedagogy, and from a sociological angle, their culture as well. So I'm interested in how martial arts have been reconstructed for different purposes. So at the moment I'm looking at historical European martial arts called HEMA, which is basically a revivalist movement of medieval martial arts mainly, as well as Tai Chi and related practices. So those are things I'm interested in. And in the seminar we had before the webinar, I was looking at traditions, the notion of tradition, how it may be inclusive or sometimes exclusive. And we looked at it from many ways a historical angle as well. So hopefully I'll be of some use, and also I'm happy to talk about health, because I'm very interested in health and well-being and health philosophies and narratives as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. George. And you will absolutely be of great value to this webinar. And you already have been to the series so far. So absolutely. So last but absolutely not least, we have Dr. Chloe Mclean. And welcome, Chloe. So Dr. Mclean sat on webinar 9 and did a fantastic presentation on coaching women and girls and in martial arts. So Dr. Mclean is also a lecturer in sociology at the University of West Scotland. So Dr. Mclean, will you share a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks very much for the introduction, Aisling. So I have been a karate practitioner for 22 years now. I used to compete internationally for Scotland at karate, and I also am currently the Director for Women and Girls Interests for Scottish Karate. As an academic, my PhD research looked at the ways in which practicing martial arts either reinforce gendered ways of using our body and stereotypical gendered relationships between men and women, or how martial arts challenge those stereotypical ways and expectations of how men and women should be and relate to one another. So my interests are very much throughout my karate practice, my role as a director, and my academic work around sort of gender within martial arts.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mclean. So to all of our viewers, whether you're here with us live or watching the recording, as you can see, we have a very broad range, a very strong panel here today that has a lot of personal and professional expertise on the topic. And so just to say, those of you who are with us here live, you can submit a question. We already have some questions that we can get started with. Some have been pre-submitted already. And if you're not familiar with the Zoom functionality, there's on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button that you can press there, and you can type your question in there as well. Or if you're having difficulty with that, you can also just simply pop it into the chat. Just make sure that you press to everybody. So without further ado, let us dive into some of these questions. So the first question that we have here is, and this one, Rana is here with us live. Hi, Rana. So Rana's first question is, she's from Jordan, one of the Arab countries that believes in the rights of individuals for both genders. But so far, and despite the state's great interest in implementing this, the idea of practicing sports for women, especially martial arts, is still not accepted by many, even practicing for people with disabilities. The question is, how can we improve and spread the right and supportive thought for women and people with disabilities to practice martial arts through her work as a PE teacher and a Taekwondo player or martial artist? So for our panelists, anybody, so you can just come in with your questions to all of our panelists. If anyone, I can see, or if anyone wants to dive in, and let's just have some interactive conversation here on this. Would you like to go first, Chloe? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. So thanks very much for that, Rana. I guess I'll start, and I'm sure that other of the panelists will have things that they want to say in response. So I think one thing that can be done to help support the cause of including more women and girls and people with disability into martial arts in Jordan, particularly from my perspective, particularly thinking about tactics for making it more acceptable for women and girls to practice, is that we can look to other Arab or Muslim countries that have very strong track records in martial arts. So for the sport of karate, for example, the women's Iranian karate team, the Egyptian women's karate team, the Turkish women's karate team are three of the top karate teams in the world, predominantly within the medals at each World Championships. And again, in the Olympics that just happened, there was many women representing these countries, Azerbaijan, another country here. So one thing that we can do, I guess, is point to other Muslim countries and say, you know, Muslim women have shown that they can be brilliant leading world champions in karate. So that's one approach, I guess, that we could take. I think your role as a PE teacher is a fantastic opportunity to share that type of knowledge with the students that you teach in your classes. I think other approaches that can sometimes help, I guess, it's identifying where there's some dubiety and where that dubiety is coming from, because that can help us address what the correct approach might be. But for example, I have a friend who taught karate in England, so a different cultural context, but nonetheless, they had 3 Muslim women who came to the women's only karate class that was run there. And at first, they just wanted to talk to the coach to find out about karate, but they weren't sure if it was appropriate for them to participate in karate or not. And the coach had a friend who also done karate, who worked very closely with the local mosque and had some sort of role within the mosque. And so he came along and spoke to the women, just talked through their concerns with them, and that encouraged those women to feel comfortable taking part in karate. So I guess maybe similar types of things can be done. That is looking for if the issue is related to concerns about whether this, for example, contradicts with Islam, for example, then perhaps try and identify martial artists that are well-respected figures within mosques, for example, and see if they could come into your class and have a chat with the students about, you know, why it's okay for women and girls to participate in martial arts as well. So that's a couple of ideas, but I'll hand over to other panelists now.
I just want to say thank you, Dr. Mclean, for such a fantastic response. You know, what I'm really hearing and what you're saying is that, you know, the importance of the culturally contextual and really supportive person-centered approach, you know, that's really coming through really strongly there. Thank you for that wonderful insight. Would anybody else like to jump in? Any of our other panelists?
I can say something a little, if you like. So there might be other degrees of what aspects of the martial arts are they interested in. So if you're using a physical education, it could be adapted maybe for the forms or sequence training or individual exercises or forms of bodily conditioning, as well as the whole martial art. So you might think, are we teaching the whole martial art with sparring, mixed sex training, body conditioning of, you know, getting punched in the stomach or grappling on the ground, or maybe are we going to adapt some of the movements for certain purposes? It might be for a module or a particular subject matter at a certain level in school, or are you going to do it for adults? So you might think of, you know, within the time period you have to teach in a school or an extracurricular activity, which aspects of the martial arts you might want to focus on. And perhaps some of those aspects might be more theoretical. They might be a bit more about the internal aspects of the body. So like how Tai Chi is often taught today, is mainly about the form and standing postures. A lot less of it is about partner training. So that might be less problematic if, for example, the interpretation of Islam or the certain region of Jordan may make it difficult for partner training. But I do know I can pass on the contact of one guy I met actually from Jordan. He's a karate practitioner and instructor called Marion, and I can get his email address in my account, and I'm happy to pass on the contact if you want a further discussion with someone working in that country.
Yeah, so I could connect to you, if you could forward that to me, George, or Dr. Jennings, and I can forward that to Rana. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I can just say, you know, I don't think there's much more I can add that hasn't already been said, but there's a couple, you know, bottom up and top down approaches from, you know, developing interest within the community. For example, if we talk about communities of persons with disabilities, developing interest amongst communities of persons with disabilities to participate in martial arts, and as we were discussing earlier, also identifying well-respected figures within martial arts who are also interested in possibly reaching out to those communities. One strategy that I've tried here in the past has been offering to go to organizations of persons with disabilities and doing a martial arts class. And that's how initially I was how I got into martial arts. Was somebody from a martial arts, from a dojo, came into my school and taught us an example class. That's how I was first exposed to it. And I've done that in the past as well, going out into, for example, an NGO that works with people with disabilities or a school of people with disabilities, and kind of demonstrating martial arts to just kind of generate some interest. So you can, in an ideal world, try to link those two strategies together and find, well-respected members of the community and see if they would be interested in going to an organization that represents people with disabilities, doing a demonstration class, or, not demonstration in the sense of demonstrating to them, but getting them involved, doing a class for that group to see if that could also possibly generate some interest amongst them. Also, it's sometimes good for instructors of martial arts to see that, oh, hey, this group of people can also is also completely capable of doing this martial art. That's something that occasionally happens where, a well-respected instructor or sensei may not even have considered it before, not out of any ill will or negative feeling, but that they had just never considered it until they've seen it done. So yeah, it's the bottom down and top up kind of, said that wrong, top down and bottom up kind of strategies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really, really like that, Nick, as well. Thank you so much. And what's coming to my mind as well, as you say, as you shared that as well, to bear in mind that there's the stages of behavior change, and which can be applied to the individual, but also to society as well. And, so there's the Prochesta and Di Clemente, if you're not familiar. So it's the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, and they have 5 stages. And the first is pre-contemplation, then contemplation. So maybe in some of these societies, so the intent is there to become inclusive, but they're not fully, many people in society might not be aware of this movement or drive or these policies, possibly even to be more inclusive. So it is just the way it is. They're just they're not even contemplating change. So, and sometimes it's just by exposure, and there's a whole, world of research and strategies for each of the different behavior stages of change as well that are really effective. So just to bear that in mind as well, maybe a lot of people in society are pre-contemplation, or maybe preparation. They might start to prepare, or, if they start to see more positive images that are socio and culturally relevant, of women or people with disabilities engaging in different forms of martial arts as well. So thank you all, everybody. And thank you very much for the question. Great question. And there are a couple of other questions that you also submitted, Rana. So through the practical experiences of trainers, also, is there an effect of menstruation for martial arts practices on athletic performance? And so this was addressed somewhat in webinar 9 on women and girls, and actually Dr. Mclean here addressed it specifically. So would you like to say a little bit more about that, Dr. Mclean?
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just start by saying I'm a sociologist rather than a physiologist. So in terms of physiology, I don't know the specifics, but yes, there is an impact of menstruation on women's performances, and certainly in the way that they feel while they're performing as well. So it's very common for women during menstruation to experience pain, to experience hot flushes, and sometimes this pain can often be more significant than is culturally recognised, because discussion of menstruation is presented as taboo, as something that women should hide. And I very much think that that is certainly not the case. I don't think that we should hide it, because it is a everyday part of many women's lives. But nonetheless, so often women will, and this includes athletes, it includes martial arts practitioners, will often feel that they have to train through and make no suggestion that they're experiencing this pain at the time. But I've known women to faint, for example, not because of the physical practice that they're doing, but just because they're on their period and their bodies are experiencing so much pain. So menstruation can have really significant impacts for women. There are studies physiological studies out there that suggest that when women are menstruating, they are less likely to perform as well in endurance sports. Interestingly, there's some stuff that suggests that maybe in things like weightlifting, for example, women can actually lift a little bit heavier when they're on their period or when they're menstruating. So there's some really interesting emerging physiological research out there. Unfortunately, there hasn't been the bulk of research in women and women athletes' experiences of menstruating as you might expect, or as there should be, because again, women's bodies are often ignored in society, and because of this ongoing stigma and taboo, which often comes around with discussions of menstruation. So much more research is needed, but there is a suggestion that yes, for things like martial arts, there is a good chance that there might be a little bit of a dip in performance for female athletes. It'd be useful for coaches to acknowledge this, just in terms of then how coaches can know how to respond to the people that they're coaching. So for example, not being a strict coach that's going to give someone a big shouting at because they've performed not as well as they usually would have, because women might have been on their period at that time, and these things happen. So it's good if coaches can recognise and acknowledge that there can be a little bit of fluctuation in women's experiences and performances because of menstruation.
Thank you, Dr. Mclean. And I think just being, for instructors to be aware of it in the first place. And I know in webinar 9, you made some great suggestions of good practice, to have a sanitary first aid kit there, and also having flexible clothing policies. If the women have to wear white, it might not be the most ideal, or it most likely won't be ideal for them when they are menstruating. And so that is on webinar 9 as well. For anybody who hasn't seen that, I highly, highly recommend that. A really fantastic webinar as well. Would anybody or any of our other panelists have anything to add there?
Yep.
No, we're okay. Well, and it's I think you kind of naturally segued, Dr. Mclean, to the other question. So there was a third question Rania had submitted, and I think, so she spoke about what is the cognitive level of trainers to deal with females? I'm wondering, I think like what I'm hearing that is, what is the level of awareness trainers need to deal with females during these physiological changes? I think you kind of addressed that there as well. Or is there anything further to add?
I mean, maybe just to say it just a very small bit more, that yes, because martial arts coaches are still predominantly men, and often there is no part of the coaching training regimes that discuss things like women's bodily changes. So often there isn't very much awareness to women's bodily changes, which can include menstruation, can also include things like menopause, pregnancy, post-pregnancy, and how and when women can come back to training. So there's a number of different stages in women's lives where there's physiological things going on, which mean that their training might need to be adapted in different ways. And unfortunately, just now there isn't a lot of awareness on exactly how is best to accommodate women's changes through the life spectrum. So it's a really interesting area. It's something where I think there are some tips that we suggested in the webinar 9, like Aisling said. So if anybody is particularly interested about that, then maybe you can pop back to that recording.
Yeah, thank you for directing people to that. And also in UNESCO ICMs, in the online introduction to inclusive martial arts, there is a little bit about pregnancy as well in there as well. So some further information to support women. And I'm kind of in this, so there is also a question to bring as well about mixed sex and women only training. And I think also we can even include in that conversation, even because it's also a conversation that often comes up in terms of including people with disabilities as well. You know, should they be just people just with disability only in certain classes, or inclusion? Now, I know in terms of course, there's always a socio-cultural context, and that's obviously the most important thing. But I know in terms of, we'll say, inclusion of people with disabilities, the ideal, or the global goal is inclusive. So every, sessions are inclusive of everybody. But we also need to acknowledge that inside of that, sometimes people with disabilities prefer to just practice with people of similar ability levels. Also, we have, when beginners, if somebody's beginning, they much prefer and feel to build their competence with people who have similar abilities, and then possibly, if they wish, go to more inclusive sessions or practice. But I'm wondering, let's just have a conversation, so, and I know all of you can address this question, whether it's, from your background of women and girls or people with disabilities. So would anybody like to jump in? So, and basically just to reiterate the question, so arguments for mixed sex and women only training, or arguments for segregated disability training, or inclusive training. Do you want to come in there, Nick? I see your hand.
Sure. Yeah, so this is something, my goal as both a person with a disability and as a researcher has always been to work towards inclusion. However, it's very much what you've said, Aisling. We don't necessarily jump from nobody in a dojo with no women, no people with disability in a club, in a gym, to perfect inclusion. There are stages and there are steps, and it really revolves around safety and comfort. Every place where I've trained, we've kind of approached it from working towards inclusion, but yeah, oftentimes we will, in order to, for example, where I'm at now, we have a solid group of women who are training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a very physical sport. But we also try to make an emphasis to do programs such as what they call Girls in Gis, which is a seminar that's only for women, or we've in the past tried to do classes only for women, until people get to a comfort level where they can start to get into more of a mixed group. And it's the same with people with disabilities. Oftentimes people with disabilities may not feel comfortable immediately jumping in to a mixed class, but we want to work them towards that stage. And if that means starting out with either one-on-one classes or classes only with people with disabilities, to try to get to a certain level of comfort, and then hopefully we can make that transition. But I think Aisling, it's very much how you introduced this topic. It goes in stages, and it really revolves around individual comfort levels, both for the students and for the instructors.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Nick, because I know there are these ideals out there, but we can't impose ideals on people if that's not really a person-centered approach, is it really? For like, well, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the Convention of Discrimination Against Women says it needs to be fully inclusive, so forget about what the women and people with disabilities want. And that's not that's not what it's about either. I think the ideal about the inclusive is that every person has the potential to participate if they wish, so that practices need to be inclusive, but that they can still may want to choose women only or people with disabilities only. And I think this kind of ties maybe in a cultural context, even coming back to Rana's question about, in Jordan and some countries where, women and not just Muslim countries, I know in India as well and other countries, men and women don't practice in close proximity or physically to each other. Would anybody else like to come in? Or Chloe, do you have anything to add there?
I wasn't sure if Colin had his hand up first.
No, wait, you go.
Oh,
first.
sorry, Colin. My apologies.
Far ahead. No, far ahead.
Yeah, I think you're very right, Aisling, that the cultural context does matter here in terms of thinking about whether mixed sex classes or women only classes are a better approach for women. If there's a culture if the country that you're running your karate or martial arts classes in is a country which has quite a lot of sex segregation, maybe in the education system, for example, men and women might be segregated, or maybe more broadly in sport settings, men and women are commonly segregated, then probably setting up a mixed sex martial arts class will seem quite daunting for a lot of women and girls, because within that country, there's not too much sex integrated activities, and therefore to have such a close contact physical sport being mixed sex might be quite a big jump. And so in these types of contexts, then yes, of course, a women's only class would make really good sense, because we know that there's lots of benefits to doing martial arts for men and women, and we want as many people to experience these benefits as possible. So in that kind of setting, then definitely a women's only class would probably make sense. Equally, if we're thinking about doing classes that are specifically for women who have survived gender-based violence, for example, equally, these women might feel uncomfortable in a mixed sex setting, or at least initially might feel uncomfortable in a mixed sex setting. So again, if that is the demographic that we are looking to bring into martial arts, then we would probably want to consider a women's only class. The benefits of a mixed sex training class is that quite commonly in the West, martial arts are trained mixed sex, and in doing so, it can challenge some of the assumed relationships that men and women should have with each other. So it enables men and women to develop really great friendships with one another, which can also start to debunk some of the myths that can be harmful, particularly for women, but also for men, about what their role in society should be. So having these mixed sex martial arts spaces can unintentionally be really good for gender equality, for creating better relationships between men and women. But as we're saying here, culture is, like the cultural context is important as to whether that's going to feel welcoming for women and girls initially. So pros and cons to both. I think the important thing is to be thinking about it, and to also be asking, the women and girls why they're coming to martial arts, if they're happy to do mixed sex, to start off there, and if they're not, then maybe a women's only class is a sort of little baby steps towards mixed sex is a possibility.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Mclean. A lot of really great information there, and some points. So Colm, coming back to
if I could just maybe give an example, when we talk about including people with a disability, mixed classes. Some years ago, a friend of mine from Belgium, who I had trained with, an able-bodied instructor, invited me to Belgium, but he suggested I bring some people with a disability over to train with his instructors. So I brought 6 wheelchair users over to Belgium. Now, my friend was very familiar working with me, but his other instructors had never worked with somebody with a disability, and they were anxious. What do we say? What do we not say? How do we not offend people? What can people do? And really all we had to do was, I met with them all beforehand, and we just had a very open discussion, and I acknowledged that they had concerns, God, what if we knock someone out of a wheelchair? We talked it all through. So it probably was one of the best training weekends I've ever been involved in. There was so much learned, both by the disabled people and by the able-bodied instructors. And the key was communication. If we had just arrived over, these 5 wheelchair individuals that I was bringing, people with disability, they'd never trained in a mixed class before. If we hadn't have done a little bit of groundwork beforehand, I think it could have been very uncomfortable and very, very stilted. But by just communicating, talking out some of the concerns, it was just, at the end of the weekend, instead of it being a group of disabled people and able-bodied instructors, you just had 15 or 20 martial artists, and some of them just happen to have a disability. So I think communications is key. Just and acknowledge that the instructors, able-bodied instructors, they don't want to exclude people, but what they don't want to do is, if they're not familiar with working with someone who has a disability, is, well, what do I not say? I don't want to offend people. What can these people do? Should I do this? Once you just have a very open discussion, and very quickly they see beyond the person's disability. I mean, as I said, that was a couple of years ago, and some of those martial artists are still in communication with some of the people with a disability. They built up friendships. So, as I said, communications is key, and then, really is a huge opportunity to include people in mixed classes. But there again, it's not always possible, but it's certainly communications is the key.
Absolutely, communication. And because really, I think in my experience as well, a lot of the time people, I think somebody mentioned earlier, they're not excluding out of any ill will. It's really just a fear of the unknown, or like you say, it's a good fear of afraid of doing harm, or afraid of hurting somebody emotionally or even physically. And there are plenty of resources out here as well. And also, a really good, there's a really good tool called the Inclusion Spectrum, which I think I mentioned a little while ago, developed by Ken Black. And it's a really valuable tool. And it's in the Inclusive Martial Arts, the online unit. It's a circle that has different settings. So for example, if you're having a mixed setting, that let me see, so that there's different ways that even inside of the setting you can break up the mixed class into, so that there's open is one, so that maybe the warm-up activities everybody could be doing together, if maybe they're not too close contact, or everyone of that there's not any discrepancy or in capability needed. So there's also modified, so even within the same session, some people could be doing an activity, everyone's doing the same activity, but some people might be doing a modified version. Different ability levels. And I think I think Nick, you spoke about this on one of the webinars as well, that actually martial arts is naturally modified, that you can have people of different levels playing all together already. So then you have the separate or the alternate, so that even within the session, you can literally have, one group over here doing one thing completely different. So they're literally doing different sessions, even under the same roof, and parallel then as well as the other one. So it's the Inclusion Spectrum. A quick Google, you'll find tons of information about that. And I know that was developed for the disability inclusion context, but I think it could possibly be relevant to all contexts as well. So anybody, Dr. Jennings, would you like to jump in, or do you have anything to add?
Sure, I might add something from the male perspective of mixed sex training. So a few years ago, Alex Channon, my colleague, and I wrote an article called The Rules of Engagement. It's mainly from his research, but I helped out with a bit of my data. But it was looking really about how the communication process works over time. So negotiation, again, things that my colleagues here have mentioned about, like, for example, seeing someone as a martial artist over time. So at the beginning, you might be a man who often we're socialized, many cultures around the world, not to hit girls and women. So maybe you have a sister, you don't hit your sister, don't hit your or a friend in school, or at a certain age, you start to be told this is wrong, although it might be okay to hit a boy. And then when you go into martial arts, maybe as an adult or as a young adult, this can be quite daunting actually to hit a woman or to hit a girl. Eventually, we start to have, through sparring, through exercises, we found that people were starting to develop strategies to feel more comfortable with touch, either painful touch or prolonged touch, for example, in grappling arts like judo or jiu-jitsu. And we found that it's generally people had positive experiences over time, those who sustained it, but it was only through negotiation and having communication. Sometimes I had women having to hit men and show that they can be powerful and quick and those kind of things. So that's something we found. So but definitely I think there's another perspective that the men may find it very difficult at the beginning to do certain things with women, but once the women have perhaps, say in a mixed group, have their own warm-up or exercise, maybe, for example, I remember one martial arts, Shalam, a Mexican martial arts, there were a partner warm-up where you tap the body, so you warm up the body by slapping the other person's body. And the women were separated and the men were separated for that exercise, but the rest of the class, it was integrated. And sometimes we did hit each other in the stomach, and there were some jokes where there was some being a bit gentler with women, whatever. But so I think it depends on the martial art and the context. There will be sometimes there'll be mixed, sometimes there'll be separation, and that depends on the cultural context, how touch is seen. And that's the type of touch of touching, say the bum or the legs might be seen as sexualized, so that's why it was separated. I don't know if that helps, but it's just a bit of observation.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It all adds to the conversation. you know, because the more and more awareness we have, the more, you know, I'm sure each of our watchers, our viewers, you know, they might be having their own ideas of what might or might not work in their own context, in their own culture. So yeah, of course. Thank you for that. I'd also like to kind of shift the conversation a little bit to, you know, if we consider, so, and I know we did cover this on one of the webinars on sustainable development, the SDGs and all of that. And if we consider, you know, martial arts as a physical activity in the broader health context, so I know in the West, we predominantly, you know, use the medical model, but there is a shift towards using a more biopsychosocial model that, you know, is more, looks at the social determinants of health and also adopts a more lifestyle related approach. And I know, Dr. Jennings, you've a lot of interest in this conversation as well, or this topic about health and well-being. And so a question here, and this is for all of you as well, about how can martial arts instructors contribute to the health story in terms of inclusion? So I'm thinking health stories in the health paradigm, this movement towards a more healthy society, and maybe even considering that actually inside of COVID and all these lockdowns and things that we've been having.
You want, I'll quickly go, and then others can add on if that helps.
Yeah, please do.
Yes, I think in terms of the stories, you might think of a story of your life, and obviously this can be from birth till death. There's a possibility to do many things in your life, hopefully, if you're able to have a long life, we hope. The martial arts often have an ability to have a longevity within many of the practices. So you can do martial arts when you're 50, 60, 70, and if you're lucky enough to live to 80 or 90, you can adjust those practices. We talked about adaptability, yeah? Or if you're in a wheelchair, you can still do your karate or your kung fu movements, whatever it is. And you can adapt that, or if you have something wrong with one side, suddenly you can still train the other side and try to adapt that. So I think martial arts enable that from a health perspective of lifelong physical activity. So that some people might interpret that, for example, as physical literacy, which is quite a popular term in research these days in physical education, though that may be, you know, controversial as well, but it's still quite useful in the sense of you're developing knowledge about your body in different forms of movement. And you can interpret that, you know, and we talked earlier about the social aspect as well. So if you want to take a more inclusive approach to health, it might be the World Health Organization's approach to mental, physical, and social well-being beyond the absence of illness. So it's not just not having a cold or not, sadly, you know, catching the virus at the moment, but it's also about feeling good about yourself, being connected to other people, and that's quite a nice open definition, which would work very well with other paradigms or philosophies in certain cultures. For example, the Chinese martial art often connect with obviously Chinese medicine and Taoist perspectives on health. And maybe through energies and through the link to emotion and thought and emotion and a reaction that's stored in the body as trauma, and how you might martial arts like Tai Chi and other practices maybe actually releasing that trauma through relaxing the body, connecting the mind and body. So there's lots of different philosophies that may link to that, but I think the nice starting point is that open definition of health from the World Health Organization. But you could also see things, like you said, the biopsychosocial model or the socio-ecological model is another model that's considers their economic aspects as well. I know one of the attendees mentioned the social economic status as well, or social class. That's a big thing. You might think of gender, but there's always gender. As sociologists, as Chloe also mentioned, you know, gender and the social class are also entwined. So there might be women from a less privileged background have more disadvantages than a middle class woman typically. So
yeah, absolutely. The intersectionality of discrimination. Yeah, yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's really, really rich. I'm wondering, it's a topic I'm very passionate about myself, so I could speak for hours on it too, but I'm wondering, would anybody else like to jump in? Go ahead, Dr. Mclean.
Yeah, just to maybe add a wee story to what George has just said about martial arts being a lifelong activity, if we want it to be. At the club that I train at, we have somebody who's trained there for many, many years, who is in his late 70s, and he's still training. I know a class that started over somewhere near me, where all the participants are 60 plus years old, which I think, there's increasingly some approaches to trying to find different ways of maintaining physical activity in older age. I think martial arts have a little bit of a step ahead in that, precisely because, as George, Colm and Nick have already said, the adaptability of martial arts and the fact that in a martial arts class, lots of different people there can be practicing the same thing, but in slightly different ways to one another. So I think we're really, I think it's really good for that. And then thinking about all the different health benefits of martial arts, again, I think martial arts are slightly different to sports. Some of the benefits that they can provide, because martial arts are more than just physical activity, but they're a journey where people can visually see themselves improving. They can set challenges as they go through the different belt systems, for example, which are very common in a lot of different martial arts. And that has some really specific good benefits for your mental health in terms of feeling like you've got a sense of purpose, feeling like there's a sense of progression in your life, alongside, of course, things to do with sense of community, which we can find in other sports as well, but that can be true. So I guess just to say there are some specific health benefits for martial arts as well, specifically around the sort of journey that martial arts provide for individuals.
Absolutely. And that came up on the webinar on tradition and inclusion as well, didn't it? I think Dr. Honda spoke about, a couple of the speakers spoke about, the socio-emotional benefits as well of like the respect that was so prevalent, in all martial arts essentially. And that was so, for me, and I'm not a martial artist myself, but I see it so prevalent in all of the panels, that all of our panelists, I see that respect for each other and how you all, are so respectful, essentially. Do you want to come in there, Nick?
Yeah, no, I just want to add two small things to what Dr. Mclean just said. One is there's also, apart from the mental benefits that Dr. Mclean already mentioned, there's also just the very positive aspect of continuing to learn into your older age, continuing to learn new things, which there's been ample evidence to show helps prevent things like Alzheimer's, dementia. Whoa. Okay, yeah, sorry, my still working on my English today. But there's a lot of benefits just to continue learning into your old age. And then the other thing is some of the physical benefits, not only when we talk about health in the sense of physical activity, but throughout the martial arts, as much for people with disabilities as people who are getting into older age, through the martial arts, you learn a lot of things such as balance, and you learn a lot of, I think what was mentioned earlier, like physical literacy. I'm not myself familiar with the term, but just based on what it sounds like, from myself as a person who is blind, when I started doing martial arts, I realized that I was developing a lot better balance, which is something that benefited me even in my day-to-day life of walking around, especially on uneven ground, doing hiking, things like that. A lot of my ability to deal with that was because I've been developing a lot more balance through doing martial arts. And it's something that my father started practicing martial arts when he was in his mid-60s. And that really helps him as far as like, even if he slipped and fell, he started to develop a much better awareness of his body and how to control himself, just outside in the wintertime, falling to the ground, not, necessarily breaking a hip or a leg, because these are all kind of physical things that we learn through practicing martial arts, just how our body works and how to move our body, control our body, and hopefully prevent injuries as we get into our older age.
Absolutely, Nick, thank you so much for that. And I'm just going to read out here a definition of physical literacy as the ability to move with competence and confidence in a wide variety of physical activities in multiple environments that benefit the healthy development of the whole person. And there's a lot of work being done on that. So that I know there's a couple of definitions. That one's from Shape America. And I know actually I know Dr. Dean Dudley from Australia. He's done a bit of work on indicators for lifelong participation. And a lot of people think, enjoyment and fun are important, which they are. But he's found actually that success is even more important. So setting people up for success in their sessions, especially if they're beginning and new to your practice. So if they're obviously enjoying the practice and they're succeeding, and achieving their goals. That's very valuable. So I'm just seeing, sorry, there's a question coming through there, but I'll come back to that one. Just in the interest of time and to move on, I just want to thank all of you though for all of your input. I'm really enjoying the richness of the conversation and your different perspectives. Colin, there's a question for you in terms of including people who, you know, somebody with a disability, so somebody who has just maybe acquired a disability or an injury, and so how about including that person into martial arts class? And I know you have experience of, so I know that you can speak to including people who don't already have a martial arts background, or somebody who does and then is coming back with the injury or their acquired disability. So could you share and give some advice and guidance, or, you know, from your own expertise on that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose if we look at from the instructor's perspective first, back to what I talked about earlier, it's about the instructor being informed and a little bit educated about the person's disability, so that when the individual comes in, they don't get a sense that this person, as in the instructor, is intimidated, as in, oh, how do I deal with this person? So one of the things I do through my work with Defence Lab is I work with instructors, so they would maybe contact me and say, listen, I've had a mom said they want to bring their little boy or their little girl in. I haven't dealt with this disability before. And really, again, it's going back to my experience in the trip to Belgium. It's just about talking it through, you know, saying to people, look, communicate, ask the individual in the wheelchair or on a stick or whatever their disability is, what are their concerns? And again, it goes back to what I said earlier. It really is just down to communications. And very, very quickly, people become relaxed. They see beyond the disability, and the disabled person sees that the trainer has seen beyond their disability. So it really, it's not massive. If I can just give another example. During my training and developing the martial arts that I do, I traveled around Europe and the UK and wherever else. And I would go to seminars and I would just arrive, book, you know, to take part. But I would always make it my business to communicate with the instructor first, because otherwise they would see this guy wheeling in a wheelchair and they'd go, oh my God, does this guy, does he know what we're doing here? You know, what am I supposed to do? I would go up and I'd say, listen, I'm such and such, give them a little details of my background and say, I'm going to sit down at the back. I'm going to observe what you're doing. Some of it will work for me, some of it won't, but I will still learn some stuff. And maybe afterwards, if you have time, we can go through a few things. So again, constant thread is just communications. Equally, the individual with the disability needs to just voice what their concerns are. You know, I'm afraid, you know, if I'm in a chair, can I tip out of it, my balance? So it really is just about both of them learning, you know, to work together. And once you talk those out, as I said, it's a lifelong journey. And we talked about the physical aspect, but there's also the confidence. And a lot of the colleagues here, I'm sure we'll talk about, you know, teaching people about situational awareness, how to, you know, be aware of situations out in the street so they never have to do anything. Again, it's not just the physical aspect, it's the confidence as well. And that's key. So again, as I said, to go back to your original question, I would say, ask questions and communicate. And then it's not really that difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just say, if there's anybody has particular questions and you want to give them my email address, I don't have a problem with that. That's not a problem at all.
Oh, thank you, Colin. Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, you mentioned there, if somebody is to be knocked out of their wheelchair, what would somebody do in that situation? You know, what would you recommend?
I suppose, well, it depends on the level of the person's disability. If their capacity is that they can get back up into their chair themselves, that goes back to what I said earlier about them communicating. I mean, I know individuals who, I'm a little long in the tooth now, so I'm not jumping up from the ground back into my chair like I might have 20 years ago. But it's about, you know, if somebody offers to give you a hand, if you need it, yeah, take it. The same as you would out in the street or the general community if you need to help up a step. So it goes back my constant thread all the time is just around communication. If someone does fall out, ask them, do they need a hand? And if they say no, I'm fine, just give them the space to get back up into the chair. Now, just on that tipping out, if I can just say something, when I'm working with people who use a wheelchair, I usually recommend they use an anti-tip bar on the back of their chair, which significantly reduces the chances, either in the street during a confrontation or in the dojo. So, you know, that's something for people to consider as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colin. And actually, while we're on, you know, while we have you here and we're talking about that, you know, I know often sometimes, you know, if somebody hasn't had experience of working with somebody or doing any kind of sport, actually, but I know, of course, in martial arts, like say, let's think of kicking for somebody who's in a wheelchair, or if the person doesn't have the use of their legs, or they may have partial use of their legs. They, you know, some people are in wheelchairs and they can walk somewhat. So, and I know you probably say it's communication, because I agree 100%. It's always about asking and communicating with the person. But if there's any coaches out there just who might still need a little bit of an encouragement to realize that, to get beyond the, okay, yes, wheelchair users can actually engage in martial arts. So what advice would you give them in terms of the kicking?
Well, what I would say is, and somebody touched on it earlier, you know, martial arts evolves, and a lot of martial arts now recognize that people are different, whether they have a disability or not. And some people are just better at kicking, or some people are better at punching. So really, it's just a matter of facilitating the person in the wheelchair and recognizing that they have some ability to kick, and again, working with them, talking with them, seeing what they can do, see what their reach is. There's no point asking them to do something that overextends what they can do, because you're setting them up for failure. So it's a case of, if it's kicking, for example, how high can you kick in the chair? Does it compromise your balance? And so again, I'm going back to communicate, ask the questions, and then you can adapt. And martial artists are great at adapting, because it's not just people with a disability, but, you know, they'll be working with people who are particularly tall, or maybe a very blocky and strong build, and they're constantly aware of tweaking their particular martial art. So really, I don't think it should be a major difference. In my case, I can't use my legs at all. So it's very much, you know, when I go to a seminar and if they're doing stuff with the legs, I say, well, listen, I'll just sit and watch. This isn't for me, but it's interesting. But when it comes to using the hands or the fists or the arms, this is where I'll sit in and learn something.
Fantastic. Thank you, Colin. Thank you for sharing all of that. We have another question here from Stephanie Stevens, but Dr. Jennings, I'm aware that you do need to hop off shortly, or...
I'm muted. Yeah, if possible. I did have a message. I was double checking if it's about the meeting. Yeah, it's about window cleaning. So, so I'm happy to answer the question if I have anything.
Well, it's just a question here, but I just wanted to acknowledge if you do need to leave. I just wanted to.
Oh yeah.
There's a question here from Stephanie Stevens. So she's asking, for those of you with a disability, what are the top 3 things you'd want to know about a dojo before attending a class? So Nick or Colin, maybe you could.
Well, does Nick want to go first? Because I've been doing all the talking for the last while.
Go ahead and address it first, then I can hop in afterwards.
Okay. The 3 things. Well, one, and again, I'm talking from the perspective of someone who uses a wheelchair. I'd be looking for good access. I would be looking for them. If there has to be some accommodation around being able to reach punch bags or some of the equipment, the floor area, if it's all mats, for me, the mats can be an issue. So it would be, is there an area that the mats can be moved so, you know, I can move a bit more, better in my chair? And just the personal needs, ideally, I would be looking to see that they have accessible changing rooms or toilets and bathrooms.
Thank you, Colin.
And mine are very, very similar. So with a visual impairment, the first thing I'm looking for is how can I access the club, the dojo, without a car? Because since I can't drive, I'm really looking at, is there is there someplace physically close enough, or is there public transportation that will allow me to get to a place? That's going to be my number one concern. After that, it's a little bit about the environment as far as, is it open, or are there a lot of, for example, like pillars in the middle of the room, or obstacles that are going to be likely, or that are going to be dangerous while, you know, I'm actually training? So is there enough space to be able to train within? And finally, one of the things for me that's super important, that I think is often overlooked, especially in some of the more like grappling martial arts, is it quiet enough for me to be able to comfortably hear within the environment? So is there loud music playing? If you go to a club that's like integrated into a larger gym, oftentimes there's music being piped in that can be too loud, that can be really distracting. For me with a visual impairment, that's really a challenge to then feel safe and be aware of the people around me. So again, a lot of the really three things that I'm looking for all have to do with kind of like access and kind of that physical space and feeling safe.
Lovely. Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much for that. And I'm wondering, you know, we can maybe extend this question, you know, to Dr. Jennings and Dr. Mclean, maybe not in terms, you know, maybe in terms of what you would look for, what you would recommend, maybe it's whether it's inclusion of people with disabilities or women and girls, what advice or recommendations you would have?
You want to go first, Chloe? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, George. So I think for women and girls, obviously there's a massive variety of reasons why women and girls might want to go into martial arts. And so there's it's not necessarily very easy to say what are the top three things that women and girls would want to know, because it can be so varied. But research has shown that women and girls, in comparison to men, prefer to know a lot of information about a sport before they commit to going to the sport. So for women and girls, they like to be able to research through a club website, for example, to find out, you know, where the classes are, what time, what does it look like. They want to be able to research and find out lots of information before they make that decision to go. So maybe it's less about there being three specific things, but more about making sure that a club has websites, Facebook pages, etc., where women and girls can find out lots of information about what's going on in their club. That's really useful for getting good numbers of women and girls through the doors in the first place. Also useful for getting women and girls, because one common question that they might have, because martial arts are traditionally seen as maybe more associated with men because it's fighting, and fighting has historically been seen as something that men do. Women and girls might want to know, is there any women or girls at this club that I'm thinking about going to? So think about that for your advertising as well. You know, if you do have women and girls already at your club, then you probably want to use some of them in your sort of promotional images for your club as well.
Thanks, Chloe. I thought maybe just more broadly about inclusion is the role of the assistant instructors as well. So as well as the main instructor, typically they have a team of, perhaps informally, of their senior students who often take part of their class or away from their own personal training to help others' development. And I've really benefited myself from learning from different martial arts through people who come over and taught me a form or have given me a few tips whispered in my ear. So I think developing the kind of community of that kind of support network is really important as well. And perhaps some of the intermediate students could actually go on to early instructor training programs or be able to access some of the information instructors are getting, like some of the online training some of you are going through at the moment. So it may just be an inclusion of, for example, I've been included in a group in Mexico where I was a new migrant and didn't really speak much Spanish. So some of the students did speak good English, and they could help the instructor who didn't really speak much English. And also in historical fencing at the moment, I'm a left-handed person, so I prefer to fence my left hand, and the assistant instructor is left-handed as well, so she helps me a lot to translate when the teacher's talking about how to block with the right hand, how to do this, and so that's really helpful for me. So I think even that's different, not necessarily maybe classified as a disability, although historically it has been left-handed people have been a stigmatized and marginalized group of people as well. So I found that being included by thanks to other students, really. So thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. So we have one more question. Unless anybody else here who's with us wants to submit, you have one final chance to submit a question as we address the final one here. And so this one is, in my club, the majority of members and instructors are male. So there's a strong macho vibe. Sometimes they make jokes that I find disrespectful or make me feel uncomfortable, and I don't know how to address this. I've brought it up once or twice and I was told to relax. It was only a joke. So this question did actually come up in one of the previous webinars, but we thought we'd bring it here as well to this one, the person had asked. So would anybody like to address that? Dr. Mclean, I see you smiling.
Yeah, it's a situation that unfortunately, you know, lots of women might have found themselves in the same situation in a martial arts setting, and it is very difficult to change a sort of macho, heavily masculine culture if that is present within the club that you train at. I don't have any, you know, golden bullet answers to resolving it. You've done the first step that I would say, which is to raise the issue with the coach, speak to the coach on the side about it on their own and say, you know, these jokes actually make me feel really uncomfortable. And I think it'll be the same for other women. You might want to have that discussion again and let them know that it might limit their ability to get and retain more women and girls within their club. And maybe if they start thinking about it as a future issue for their income, that might be the motivating factor to start the change process. Unfortunately, as Aisling said earlier, change takes time, and it does take time for people's set of ways and norms and behaviours. It takes a long time for people to change them, but you've started well by raising the issue. And although you didn't get a good response initially, you've perhaps planted a seed which has raised some awareness. I would say go back to them again. If it happens again, speak to the coach again, let them know that again, still you feel uncomfortable about X, Y, or Z that was said in class today. This could affect your future retention of women and girls. And that kind of keeps things bubbling over for them. If there's any senior women who are well respected in your federation or in your association, they might not be in your club, but they might be in a sort of broader set of clubs that's part of your sport. You could maybe speak to them and see if they'll speak to your coach about it, because perhaps it shouldn't have to be this way, but perhaps they might warrant more respect. And so they might listen to this senior female who has a high role within some level of your sport. So that's some things to think about in terms of addressing the behaviour. Other things you might want to do alongside this is setting up a little sort of networks with other women, either within your club or more broadly within your sport, where you can share these types of experiences and share tips on how others have addressed those issues. So I know that it's not a great answer, but hopefully there might be some helpful things in that.
Oh, I think it is a great answer. Dr. Mclean is very thoughtful and thorough, because there is no black and white solution. And I'm also wondering if some of our males on here might like to input as well, because I know sometimes as well, you know, those of us who aren't part of the marginalized group, so to say, or the group that's been discriminated against, we have so much more power and privilege than we realize, that sometimes if we can actually make change and we can become allies as well for, we'll say, women and girls, males for women and girls, or men for women and girls, I should say. And also people who don't have disabilities can be great allies for people with disabilities as well, as long as we're letting them take the lead. But I wonder, would anybody else like to jump in? I know we've gone over time a little, but I think this is a good conversation.
Can I make a quick comment?
Please do, Colin, please.
It might be worth the person who asked the question. A lot of organizations have governing bodies, and they have very good policies and procedures. And it may help to go and have a look, talk to the governing body, because they're very conscious of what is acceptable behavior and looking after the participants in the particular sport. And there's huge competition. So go and talk to the governing body, see what rules and strategies they have. They may come and do a talk just to remind the instructors that, you know, really in this day and age, this sort of behavior just isn't acceptable. And the governing body really doesn't want clubs to behave like this. You know, you'll usually find they're very willing to support the broader martial arts group, particularly including women or people with disability.
Yeah, great suggestion, Colm. Anybody else like to jump in?
I want to reiterate, I think what you were saying, Aisling, too, is look for allies as well. I'm sure there are probably also men within the environment who are uncomfortable with that language as well, or with like the sort of jokes that are going on. I know I've seen it happen in a number of places, and I'm not particularly comfortable with oftentimes some of the joking or whatever that happens. So yeah, as Aisling was saying, you know, look for allies within that group. And I think a little bit of what I believe Dr. Mclean was saying is too, I mean, you can always present it as a business, a threat to their business, because people will leave. People will certainly leave if they don't find the environment opening and welcoming. So I think when you attack the purse, that is often a good way of convincing people for change.
Absolutely. Dr. Jennings, would you like to come in? Or, you know, we're coming to the close anyway, so if there's anything you'd like to come in or close with?
Yeah, sure. I was thinking as just a recent experience that even though I'm male, there is still some we also receive kind of sexist or gendered language by other males sometimes, because I'm quite known to be defensive in fencing. So I often circle the opponent, get out of the way, and people make jokes about me kind of running away or whatever. And then one guy said recently, he's like, you know, fight like a man, he said to me, and inspired me, you know, in one-on-one situation. So I felt like, you know, I also received this kind of thing, even though I'm a man, they don't deem me as masculine enough by like standing in the center of the kind of scenario and sort of smashing each other. And I prefer to dive out the way or move. And that's my style. Some students recognize that and like it, and they might make some jokes, but good jokes. But this guy seemed to have an issue with my approach, more defensive approach. So sometimes even though males are males, we often do receive some kind of comments that are quite annoying sometimes, or perhaps out of context. So just thought I'd share that recent experience, that we also get the brunt of things as well.
Yeah, I think it comes back to busting through those gender expectations that Dr. Mclean mentioned at the beginning. And you know, and as we can see, you know, there's still work to be done when it comes to inclusion. You know, we're not quite there yet, and it's inclusion of everybody. And you know, all we can do is continue moving forward, continue learning more, continue asking, reflecting ourselves, you know, and just realizing that it's a journey. We never quite, you know, when we'll get there, who knows, whether it'll be within our lifetime or, you know, a legacy that we'll leave behind, but it's a journey. And I think once we can realize that and settle in, and as Colm keeps saying, keep communicating with the people that we're working with, you know, and keep providing that person-centered, inclusive approach. But so we're at the end of our time together. I really want to just offer my sincere gratitude to everybody here. So each of our panelists, Dr. Mclean, Dr. Jennings, Nick, Colm, and also to each of our attendees that many of you have been joining. I'm familiar with many of your names now throughout the course of the webinar series. And of course, sincere gratitude to all those at UNESCO ICM, in particular Dae-Young Lee, who's been the coordinator of this project as well. It's been an absolutely fantastic journey together throughout the webinar series, all the different topics that we covered. And as per usual, this recording, well, maybe you're watching it on YouTube right now, but for those of you who are watching live, it will be available on the UNESCO Chair's YouTube channel and also UNESCO ICM's channel also. So with all that being said, thank you so much to everybody, to each of you. I'm seeing all your comments there in the chat. I didn't have time to reply to each one of them. It's been an absolute joy, a pleasure, and it's been so inspiring and reassuring to know that so many people are interested in inclusion in martial arts or inclusion in general. So it's been wonderful. And Thank you, everybody. Wishing you a wonderful day, wonderful evening, wonderful night, wherever you are in the world. Our deepest, our blessings, our greetings to you and your ongoing journey towards inclusive practice. See you all, everybody, and thank you all so much.
See you then. Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.